Let's look at verse 16 through 20 again. And no one can read this passage without being deeply impressed with the honesty of Jesus, because he tells his men of the trials ahead. The state would persecute them. The church would persecute them. And the family would persecute them. Jesus warned his men that in the days to come, they might find the state and the church and the family would join against them. And he goes on to explain the reasons for the persecution of the king's messengers. Now, looking at things from our point of view, it's difficult to understand why a government would persecute them. Their only aim was to live in purity and charity and reverence. But they were accused of being cannibals because of the words spoken of Christ's body and drinking his blood in the sacrament. They were accused of immorality because of the title of their weekly feast, Agape, the love feast. And they were accused of being disloyal and disaffected citizens because they would not take the oath to the Godhead of the emperor. Other charges were more serious. There were accusations about them tampering with the family. Christianity appeared to be something that divided parents and children and husbands and wives. And a big concern to the Roman Empire was their concern regarding the slaves. They were afraid that the slaves would rise up and revolt and rebel. The Christian church didn't try to free them, but they treated them as equals. It was possible for a slave to hold a high position in the Christian church. And in the early 2nd century, 2 of the bishops of Rome had been slaves, and it wasn't uncommon for a slave to be an elder or a deacon. So the Christian church must have seemed to be a force that was disrupting the very basis of the civilization they knew and threatening the very existence of the empire. In verse 23, Jesus is telling his men that in the days of persecution, a certain danger would always threaten the Christian witness. He told his men to be wise. There should be no wanton waste of Christian lives, and that they must not pointlessly and needlessly throw their lives away. Jesus was speaking in a way that the Jews would recognize and understand. When there was a question regarding public sanctification or open profession of God's name, duty was plain. Man must be prepared to lay his life down. Suppose a Jew was seized by a Roman soldier who mocked him, saying, eat this pork. Then the Jew would eat the pork because of God's laws that life is given, not death. But if the soldier said, eat this pork as a sign that you are ready to worship Jupiter and the emperor, then he would have to lay his life down and die. So suppose a Jew, back up, let's have a principle here. When we're persecuted, we must not abandon our faith. When we are persecuted, we must not abandon our faith. When we are persecuted, we must not abandon our faith. Verse 23, This passage contains one strange saying that we cannot neglect. You will not complete your tour of the cities of Israel until the Son of Man shall come. The people of the early church believed intensely in the second coming of Jesus, and they believed it would happen soon, certainly in their lifetime. Within 30 years of the cross, the message of crucified and risen Christ had swept across the world, and it had reached Rome, which was the capital of the world. Matthew is writing between AD 80 and 90, and he uses this saying to foretell the spread of the kingdom and the return of Christ. So now in verses 24 and 25, Jesus is warning his disciples that they must expect what happened to him to happen to them. The warning is that Christ carried the cross, and so shall the individual Christian carry the cross. Jesus calls us to share in his glory and his warfare, his agony, and share in the fruits of his glory. He gives us a statement of privilege, and that is to suffer for Christ is to share the work of Christ. To have to sacrifice for faith is to share the sacrifice of Christ. When the trial gets hard, we have to tell ourselves we are treading where the saints have trod, where the feet of Christ have trod. Here's your principle. We have to share in the struggle of Christ to share in the glory of Christ. We have to struggle we have to share in the struggle of Christ to share in the glory of Christ. We have to share in the struggle of Christ to share in his glory, in the glory of Christ. Write that down the best way you heard it. Sorry about that. We have to share in the struggle of Christ to share in his glory.